Crafter. Today we are going to be making a paper mache clay pumpkin. This project turned out so cute and it's really simple to make. The first part of this project is to get our paper ready. So I'm using a roll of toilet paper and I'm gonna boil some water and let the paper sit in the water for a day or two so that way it can break down more. So while I was waiting on the water to boil, I went ahead and unwound my roll of toilet paper and tore it into smaller pieces just to help break down the paper even more. And then once my water boiled, I poured it in there. And I had to add 2 teapots full to get my paper fully submerged. And then I used a plastic spoon to just push all of the toilet paper into the water. And I also added a little bit of salt at this step and mixed that in since this will be sitting and I of course don't want it to mold. While I let the paper soak overnight, I worked on making my pumpkin mold. So to make my mold, I used toilet paper and paper towel tubes. You can also get a thin cardboard from a cereal box or a tissue box, and you can cut that up and make tubes if you don't have tubes of toilet paper handy. I used 7 cardboard tubes for my pumpkin, where I had 1 in the middle and 6 going around it. And now I need to build a little bit more of the pumpkin shape. So for the 6 cardboard tubes on the outside, I cut 5 slits into the cardboard to make 4 little tabs, and then I folded the tabs over, kind of overlapping, to make the top curve inward a little more. I decided to cut my tabs a little bit longer and then use some masking tape to tape it over. And as you can see, it creates that kind of rounded shape to the top. And I did that same process with all 6 of my toilet paper tubes that are on the outside. And then it was time to attach them all together. So I attached each of my tubes to the centerpiece by using a piece at the top and a piece at the bottom of each of my tubes. Then I used masking tape to cover the top. I also wanted to add a stem to this pumpkin, but I don't have the greatest footage of this because I was playing around with some different designs. But basically I took a little piece of cardboard that's a tube and then I cut it and then folded it on itself so that it was kind of a cone shape, and then I taped that together and then cut the point off the cones so I had kind of a cylinder that got narrower as it went up. And at first I made a tall stem, but I didn't like how that was turning out, so I ended up cutting that off later by just using the masking tape to tape it all together. And then this I forgot to do at first, but really important, you're going to want to stuff your frame, because if you're trying to press your paper mache clay onto your form and it's all hollow, it's just going to squish and it's not going to stick well. So I just used some plastic grocery bags to stuff the inside of my pumpkin and then used more masking tape to tape the bottom to hold them all in. You may also want to tape the outside tubes to each other. I didn't do that at first, but I was like, that would make it just a little stronger, so that's another option as well. You do want your form to be fairly sturdy. So I got that all taped together, and then it was time to finish making the paper mache clay. So I let my paper soak overnight and it kind of looks really nasty, but then I loaded it up into my Vitamix blender and I only did about maybe 1.5 to 2 cups of paper at a time, and I made sure to add plenty of extra water, probably a good 2, 3, maybe even 4 cups of extra water, so that way it would blend well. And if you have enough water, you can kick it up all the way to the highest setting, and I let it run on the highest mixing setting for about 2 minutes until it looked something like this. And then what I find works best for straining it is to go outside over a little area that you want to water. So I held the strainer over the side of my back porch, and then I poured the mixture into it so the water could start running out through the strainer. And then that whole big thing of paper actually squishes down into just a little bit, so I squeezed the water out with my hand and then moved it into my other bucket and did that with all of my paper. But the advantage of doing it this way is then any paper bits that are in your water, they just land in your yard and they will decompose over time. Also, another tip for cleaning off your strainer and any other utensils is to have a big bowl in the sink and rinse your items into that big bowl in the sink, and then that bowl will catch all the paper bits from your other utensils, and then you can just dump that outside instead of sending all the paper bits down your drain. So once our paper is all processed, it's time to start making our paper mache. And I'm going to be using this awesome recipe I got from Craft Studios. Be sure to go check out their channel. Now, because I didn't have enough of all the materials, I kind of have the recipe, and then later on in the process, I made a couple mistakes. So if you want to get all the tips and tricks and get this recipe to turn out perfect, definitely go check out Craft Studios YouTube channel. And of course, I will link to that in the description and in the cards. But for me, what I ended up doing was I added 4 ounces of glue, and I'm using Elmer's glue, just some kind of basic PVA glue, so it's like an Elmer's glue or a tacky glue. And then to that I added 2 tablespoons of cornstarch, and they can be heaping. I also added a teaspoon of baking powder. Again, this one doesn't have to be exact. And then about 1.5 teaspoons of vinegar. I used apple cider vinegar, and I just kind of approximated this measurement. And then lastly, a teaspoon of salt. Once you mix those 5 ingredients, go ahead and mix it all together and it will start getting kind of thick. It's almost like making a slime just before everything gets all mixed together, where it's got just a little bit of kind of a gunkiness to it and kind of a bit of a grab, but it's a really smooth mixture. So once those are mixed together well, we're going to add a tablespoon of oil, and I just used basic vegetable oil, and then we'll mix that in. And at this point, it'll definitely thicken up just a little bit more, and it kind of reminded me of slime at this point. So now it's time to start adding in the paper, and I started by adding in a 1/4 cup at a time. Based on the recipe I'm following, I was thinking I would only need a 1/4 cup of paper, but it was definitely not enough paper for the amount of glue mixture. So I kept adding it in about a 1/4 cup at a time, but then I quickly started losing patience and started just kind of throwing it in there. So I'd kind of add a little bit, mix it, add a little bit, mix it. But if you find you think you need to add more paper, definitely go slowly. I added too much. I got overzealous in adding my paper, and it made my clay a little bit more crumbly. I chose this recipe specifically because I wanted a really smooth paper mache, and at one point the texture was so perfect, but then I thought it was still a little too sticky, and I added more paper, and I really should have stopped when I thought it was perfect. So if you don't add too much paper, this recipe turns out really smooth, but if you add too much like I did, it will become more and more crumbly. As I kept adding paper, I started mixing by hand so that way I could really feel the texture and see how well the clay would hold a shape and how well it would stick to itself. And then I added a little too much and was like, oh, I better stop here. But I still ended up with a pretty nice clay. So then we're going to take our cornstarch again, and we're just going to sprinkle just a little bit more onto it, because the cornstarch is what I think helps make this clay really smooth. So I mixed that all in, and then I'll take that last bit of stickiness out of it. And then it was time to start adding the paper mache clay onto my pumpkin form. My plan was to do 2 layers. I didn't quite have enough to do a full 2 layers, but when I was doing the first layer, I made sure to go as thin as I possibly could with my clay, because the thicker you go, the longer it will take to dry. And I recently did some paper mache projects that I had to toss out because I made the layers too thick and they did not dry and they just molded. So yeah, you want to avoid the molding, but I was really happy with this recipe. It dried really well and I didn't have any issues with molding. But I just kept building the paper mache up slowly in a thin layer on my pumpkin form, and then I let it sit to dry for a few days. So then I came back once I was positive my pumpkin was completely dry, and as you can see, it's got some splits and cracks in it. That's somewhat common with paper mache because it tends to retract as it dries, but I'd saved some extra paper mache for just this purpose and if there were any areas I wanted to touch up. I also wasn't a fan of the long pumpkin stem. It wasn't turning out the way I was envisioning it, so I just took a little tree limb saw and hacked the top of that off of there. At this point, I was also able to get a really good feel of what the paper mache was like once dry. I was really happy with how sturdy this recipe was, and of course you can crush and break this paper mache, so don't be super rough with it, but it definitely takes some effort to break it. Before I started adding layer 2 of my paper mache clay, I decided to add a little bit of glue, water, and cornstarch to the paper mache I had left because it had sat out for quite some time, and of course in a closed container, but it was a little bit dry and I wanted to make sure it would stick really well. And this time I used Aleene's tacky glue because I was out of Elmer's, but they're in the same category of glue, and I just eyeballed this and just mixed it in. And then once I was happy with the consistency and it was sticking well, I started doing layer 2, which was the touch-ups for my pumpkin. So of course I covered the top, and it didn't want to stick at first because it was touching the plastic bag, and paper mache does not stick well to the plastics. But once I started pressing it into the already dry paper mache clay, it held really well. So I first fixed my stem, I covered the top, and then you can also add some details and textures. So you know pumpkin stems, they kind of have those ridges on them. I added a couple of those. And then I moved on to filling in the cracks all over my pumpkin, so that way I had a really smooth and nice finish. Again, I'm working in just light layers so that way it can dry easily and not lead to mold. But like I said, I didn't have any issues with this recipe molding. I was super happy about that. I had some areas where chunks fell off completely, so I just used my wet paper mache as kind of like a mortar, and then my dry paper mache, I was able to stick it in there and then just fill in the little crack around the edge, and was able to reuse some of my dried paper mache in that way. So then once I used up all my paper mache clay and had it looking awesome, I left it out to dry again. A few days later, I came back and was ready to paint it. So I used these little acrylic paints, these apple barrel ones. This color here is pumpkin orange. And then I didn't have a sponge brush handy, so I just cut up a kitchen sponge, and little tip is to add some water so it doesn't absorb so much of the paint. I also wasn't wanting like a bright neon orange pumpkin, so I had this other brown paint. I have no idea where I got this. It might be an AC Moore brand. If you know who stocks these paints, let me know in the comments below. But I added just a little bit of this brown color to my orange pumpkin and mixed those in just to create a little bit more of a muted tone to my orange versus the extremely bright orange. So finally I got out my foam paintbrush and that went on so much better, and I finished adding all the orange to my pumpkin. After the orange dried, I was ready to paint my stem, and I had this light mocha tan color, but it just looked very like sickly human Caucasian flesh color. I wasn't really feeling it, so again I added a little bit more of that brown to just tone it down a little bit and even it out. And then I put my first coat of this paint onto my pumpkin stem. And when you're adding the stem, just bring the paint down as far as looks natural. And then I also added some little triangles and points kind of pointing down the pumpkin to give it a more natural look. So then I grabbed a stiff brush and some more of the brown paint, and I'm going to do this dry brush technique where I put a little bit of paint on my brush and then I dabbed most of it off, and then I just lightly brushed it onto my pumpkin, and this creates some depth and texture. I wanted to add some more of the brown tone to it because it was still looking like sick human flesh. It was kind of weirding me out. It was not the look I was going for with my pumpkin. So I added the brown with this dry brushing technique, and then to just continue building up the layers, I got a little bit of my tan, mixed it with the brown, and then dry brushed that on there while the dark brown was still damp, and that just kind of blended in together. And then I let it dry completely, and then added one more layer of the brown paint with just the light dry brush technique, and I was really happy with how those layers turned out. Going slowly like this and adding layers can give some really neat effects, and I'm really happy with how the pumpkin stem turned out. So then as a last little touch, I hot glued on some of this little raffia, this straw type stuff. I picked this up at Dollar General last year for another project, and I had some left over, so I was like, you know, I'll go ahead and add some on. I use my hot glue to attach it, and this is really awesome because if the part where your orange of your pumpkin meets the stem of the pumpkin, if that doesn't look so nice, you can cover it up and blend it in really nicely, and nobody has to know if the paint job is messy. So I went all the way around the stem of my pumpkin, gluing on little pieces, and I wrapped some around, and then I even tied a longer piece into a bow and glued that on there. I cleaned up my glue strings, and then my pumpkin was complete. I think this turned out so cute. There were definitely some hiccups along the way of this project for me, but in the end, it turned out so adorable. I absolutely love this project. And I like it because you can customize it, make it look however you want. It's a fun and affordable craft that helped me expand some of my fall decor. So now I want to hear what you think. Let me know in the comments how you think my pumpkin turned out, and let me know if you're going to be trying this project as well. Be sure to go check out Craft Tree Studio. Their YouTube page has paper mache tips and tricks that will definitely help you if you're going to tackle this project. But I really appreciate you guys watching. Thank you so much. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and come back next week for another video. Happy crafting! Life tip: when you're cleaning your blender and you add soap into the blender, don't leave the blender running so long that the soap foam overflows because it's very messy and difficult to clean up.